talk for a minute about, we're talking about closing costs, and we're talking about the estimate of those closing costs and the loan fees and all those kinds of things. I want to switch over and talk about what is included in the contract, because I think there's been some confusion lately, and a lot of what we do on the show is prompted by questions that we get and confusion that we see in the marketplace, right? Mm-hmm. So you work with a lot of buyers. I don't know, you've got, 47-something contracts in the process right now. And when you show a number of houses and you make that final selection on which house you're going to make an offer on, you've got to go through and figure out if there are things in the house that your buyer needs to have. Some of those are naturally included, some are not, right?
Right.
So there's a list in the contract. We all use the same contract,
Mm-hmm.
and it's basically the items that are included by contract in the house. And what I've always explained to folks is if it's nailed down, it stays.
Bolted in.
Attached.
Mm-hmm. If it's attached, it stays. If it's not nailed down, it doesn't stay unless you ask for it,
you
right?
always include it. If you have any question whatsoever, you always include it.
Right. And so if you, read the contract, and we know that people don't always read it as carefully as we want them to,
Mm-hmm.
but there's a list. So like things like the mirrors in the house, stay or don't stay?
If they're bolted down, they stay.
They stay.
Right.
And even if they're not bolted down, if they're just hanging on a wall in a bathroom, for instance,
Right.
they stay.
Exactly.
Right. TVs mounted on the wall, stay or don't stay?
The TVs don't, but technically the mount does. That's on the wall.
Yeah, and here's the funny thing about that is it's not mentioned anywhere.
Right.
And when the contract was written, which was 100 years ago, and it's been updated and revised by 1,000 lawyers over 100 years, but the last revision was a couple of years ago, and they still didn't address it, even though probably every house we see nowadays has.
There's always TV mounts.
And I think that's a real gray area, right? And my feeling is that it's weird because the TV doesn't stay,
Mm-hmm.
and the mount is always two pieces, right? The part that holds to the wall and the part that holds to the TV. And I think that the part that holds to the TV doesn't stay, but the part that holds to the wall does stay. So, you've got this. It's
useless.
Exactly.
It's really important information from a lending perspective, because these items that are just there are personal property and they're not considered real estate.
Right.
And that impacts the appraisal and what can be on a contract and what can't be. So it's a very important conversation, and for the customer to know, for the buyer to know, hey, this is not necessarily going to stay. And if you want it,
you might have to buy it separately, and that's what we sometimes do is assign some sort of market value
Right.
to personal property. Hot tubs, spas, TVs, antennas, satellite antennas. What else? I mean, there's
pool equipment, pool tables,
Right.
There's a multitude of things
Right.
that, somebody could ask for.
But in general, if it's nailed down, it stays. Shelving in a basement. A lot of times you'll see, somebody will build some custom shelving or
Mm-hmm.
something like that. Stay or not stay?
Yeah, I mean, that stays.
If it's bolted in,
Mm-hmm.
it has to stay, right?
Exactly. But
Yeah.
if they're freestanding shelves, then, they can expect them, but...
And the other thing that, we run into a lot is somebody might have a play set in the yard, right? So the play sets aren't mentioned anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And the buyer may want that play set to be removed. And so if you go silent in the contract, then what happens? I mean, if you want the play set to be gone and you don't mention anything in the contract, and the day of closing, you go for your walkthrough, and there's this big play set.
Yep. Then you go on Craigslist the next day after closing.
But the point is that it's not just what's included by the contract, but if you want something to be excluded, right? So like if, your dining room chandelier was, a family heirloom that grandma had in her house, 100 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
Is that included in the contract?
Technically it is.
It is. And so if you want to take that with you,
Right.
You've got to exclude that, and not just on the seller disclosure form, which everybody has to complete a seller disclosure form, but on the contract itself, it has to be excluded, right?
And still, there's so many times that we go to final walkthroughs and there's items taken that shouldn't be taken.
Right.
Because sellers don't know.
Right, exactly. And so it's just really important, I think, on the buy side and the sell side to know what the contract says, to read the contract, right? So if your house is currently listed, or if you're planning to list it, which Rod Realty Group, you want to read that contract, because it's going to be what drives the transaction. Almost 100% of the time, it's going to be the St. Louis Association of Realtors contract. So you really need to know what is technically included, what is excluded. If there are things that you have in your house or attached to your house that you don't want to follow what the contract says, you got to write it into the contract at the time of negotiating the transaction, right? Mm-hmm. And understand that if some of those items are true personal property, that they might be in that negotiated contract. But Mike, what's going to happen when the underwriter
going to ask you to remove it from the contract?
Exactly. And so,
because again, it's not real estate, it's personal property.
And that doesn't mean that the seller can't sell the buyer his pool table, because it happens all the time.
That's right.
But there's a difference between real property and personal property. So I don't want to beat it to into the ground, but it is important, I think, to understand what the contract says. And just real quick, I'm going to mention appliances, because attached appliances are included. Yep. Refrigerators are not included unless they're built in, right? Mm-hmm. And in this market, I don't know, what do you think? Half of the houses, they ask for the refrigerator in the
definitely.
contract?
I mean, all of the, deals that I've done, we always ask for the fridge.
Always ask for
even
the fridge.
Even if it's a junky fridge. I mean, because people like an extra fridge.
And most of the time when you ask, you get, right? What about washer, dryer?
Washer, dryer, no, it's not included.
Not included. So the point is, read your contract, talk to your agent. If you have any questions, call me, Damian Gerard, or call Ryan Zimmer. You can reach either of us at 314-677-6508. Stay tuned. We're going to be right back. We're going to have some premiums coming up. We love to give stuff away, and so we're going to have our premium when we come back from the break.